G'day. Today we're going to look at Chapter 2 of Crow Country by Kate Constable, and we're going to be looking at the different features of this chapter, looking specifically at the plot. And just to remind you, they are the things that I've highlighted in yellow. Green is anything to do with character. Blue is generally looking at setting. Purple are the ideas, and pink are the literary devices. Now, don't forget, it's a general guide. Sometimes it's difficult to classify things under those certain headings clearly. Alright, let's see how we go with chapter number 2. Now, it starts off with this unusual phrase, "In a daze, Sadie stumbled back across the lake bed, her shoes heavy with mud." So we're opening this chapter, and opening this paragraph, of course, in a confused manner, and there is obviously some sort of lapse that has been experienced here, and the audience, we are equally confused here. It's not just Sadie who's in this state of confusion, and unfortunately that has to happen. We have to be confused before we can become made aware, before we can before the truth or the answers can be revealed to us. So we have to go through this experience, unfortunately. Next we move on to this bit of self-talk from Sadie. "Get a grip," she told herself fiercely. "You're imagining things to stop yourself dying of boredom. You dreamed it, that's all." So this is her reaction, her response to the events of the previous chapter, and how she wasn't sure of exactly how to take what she was experiencing. As we move on, we've got quotations here like, "Her mother would be phoning a psychiatrist before Sadie had even finished speaking." That is, if she actually listened to her in the first place. So there's a bit of melodrama going on here, a bit of teenage sort of angst, I guess. And it describes to a certain degree the relationship that Sadie has with her mother. There's obviously not the closeness that you might expect in some family relationships, but this is typical teenage sort of stuff. There's a bit of rebellion going on, a little bit of separation, a little bit of distance developing between some of these characters. And that's particularly highlighted in the line, "That is, if she actually listened to her in the first place." Because, of course, Sadie doesn't feel like she gets listened to. More likely she would just say, "That's nice, darling," which is a very cliched sort of response that a lot of young people think that they receive. And then we move into this very vivid description. The sun slanted into Sadie's eyes, and she realised with a start that it was late in the afternoon. How long had she been at the old lake? She hurried along the deserted track back towards the town, past the pale paddocks that rolled away on either side, blank as empty pages in the weak winter sunlight, across the wide, silent train tracks and the abandoned railway station, past the shabby weatherboard houses scattered beside the road, up the hill along the main street, toward the railway hotel and the grey stone soldier on the war memorial. And a lot of these images are very quintessential Australian, very commonplace in outback Australia, and this could be any country town, this sort of description. It could suit any stereotypical Australian country town. But even though that's true, it's still a really good use of imagery, and the fast pace of the description highlights Sadie's emotional state there as well. In the next paragraph, I've highlighted this in purple. Sadie had stormed out of the house in the middle of an argument with her mother. When she got back, Ellie would probably yell at her, "Don't you walk out on me when I'm talking to you." That was the problem. Ellie always talked. She never listened. And we've had that idea already represented in this chapter, where clearly Sadie doesn't feel like she has much of a voice, doesn't have much of a say in this particular relationship. And she's, again, going through this self-talk. She's catastrophizing in terms of how her mother will react. She doesn't know for sure. She's not there, so it's a typical response, if you like, from a teenage mind. But already we're starting to build a bit of an understanding of the characters and their relationships, which is really important. It moves on, and we're looking here at the names of the inscriptions at the Anzac Memorial. C has it, L has it, W has it. And there is symbolism in this name here, and of course, or connotations perhaps, because the word hazard itself is something that should be avoided. It is something that's potentially going to cause harm, and we will soon see how that relates to these names here. But names are typically very important in terms of their symbolic meaning. As the chapter progresses, Sadie notices that there are more Mortlocks than hazards, almost as if it's some sort of, I don't know, competition. And this does set up a little bit of the conflict that is going to follow in the later chapters. And there is some pretty serious conflict between the hazards and the Mortlocks, and it relates to the history between these two families. But they're obviously quite important and pivotal families in this community because they are celebrated, or recorded at least, on this Anzac Memorial. Let's move on. Let's go to the next page. And we've got this description here. The kids at the high school staring at her and ignoring her, thinking she was a snob because she came from the city. Ellie had found a nursing job at the local hospital. I can walk to work every day. We'll be able to spend more time together. But so far, Ellie had poured all of her energy into trying to make friends with the locals. She didn't have any time left over for Sadie. They might as well have stayed in Melbourne. At least in Melbourne, Sadie had her own friends to hang out with. So it's these moments that really capture that divide between mother and daughter. And you've got the italics here that represents the things that Sadie thinks her mother has said or might say in these instances. She's thinking back to a time when she's heard her mother say those things. But there's clearly two very different ways of thinking about the move to Bort, and Sadie was obviously against it, and Mother Ellie had to make the decision. We've got here a sense of there's being a considerable amount of time passing. They've moved in a month before, so even though we're into the second chapter of the text, there's already this notion that there's been a settling period, and that our characters should be over the initial phases of settling in and starting to look at ways to feel more comfortable, which is exactly where we find them. And we've got this reference to the word home, and it's in italics. They'd moved in a month before, but to Sadie, it still wasn't home. Home was the cream brick house near the sea, where she lived all her life. And placing this word in italics highlights how important and significant it is to Sadie, and the term home has connotations of belonging and warmth and safety, and Sadie doesn't feel any of these things at this new location, at this new township, in this new place of Bort. And that's to be expected. Any upheaval, any change is going to have some sort of ramifications and going to cause some conflict for our characters. Every morning Sadie woke up to that wallpaper and the light seeping in through an unfamiliar window, and the loss of home punched her in the stomach afresh. I love that description of how physical it is for Sadie. She is so traumatized by this move, by being in this unfamiliar place, that it feels like she's actually being physically attacked. Great use of descriptive language there. And it means that as an audience we can really feel, or we can really imagine just how severe that sense of loss is for Sadie. Ellie would love it if she made some friends in Bort, but Ellie had dragged Sadie to live in the middle of nowhere without consulting her, and Sadie was determined to punish her mother by being as miserable as possible. So we've got a couple of things going here. So it's again looking at the relationship between the characters and how Ellie would really like it if her daughter was able to fit in and feel comfortable and feel safe. But Sadie's dogged determination to make sure that doesn't happen in spite of herself. So she's going to go out of her way to be as unhappy as possible so that she can make her mother unhappy. Now that's a horrible thing to do, and it's the sort of thing, it's a very stereotypical teenage angsty thing to see. And how accurate that is, and how realistic it is that people might actually go through that, who knows. But at least in this instance we can understand why Sadie would feel that way, even if we don't agree with what she's trying to achieve there. And then we've got this gap in the chapter, and it moves into this second phase, if you like. And it reads, "Perched high in a gum tree, the crow watched as Sadie trailed slowly along the road that ran around the edge of Little Lake." So it's a slightly different focus here, and we've moved into something that has more of a connection with the land and with place. And the language changes considerably from the previous paragraph. Here we move into much more peaceful and serene description of the environment. It's almost as if this portion of the text is written from a different perspective, and we are seeing the world from Crow's perspective, or from the perspective of someone who has been in this place and does feel that sense of belonging, not like Sadie. The crow here, I've noted that it's important to watch for the presence of crows. In this instance it highlights the shift into this different perspective, so we've got a different way of seeing things here. And it tells us this quite directly. The crow saw the other houses strewn along the shores of Little Lake and nestled in the shadow. So we are seeing things differently here. The new marks had overwritten the old signs. The landscape was crisscrossed with roads, railway tracks, electricity towers, boundary fences. When the settlers came, they cleared the land. The remaining trees clustered close to the water. Lonely scribblers spelling out their own tale of survival. Houses sprouted like mushroom colonies. New stories were scratched across the land. I really like this quotation because it tries to capture this idea that the landscape has a story to tell. Stories aren't just things that are passed on in novels or that we speak to one another. The landscape itself can have a story to tell, and that's an aspect of the Aboriginal culture that we see revealed throughout this novel. And I guess what it's trying to highlight is that the Western influence in this area ignores those stories, and it tries to overwrite them. It tries to control the landscape, and therefore constructing the stories themselves and ignoring the traditional stories and the history that was left behind. So the clash of cultures is represented there, or at least touched on, or at least introduced to us at this stage. But the crow could read the old signs, the old stories. They might be hidden, but they had not vanished. Crow was hidden, too, but it was not gone. So we've got this idea of there is still a connection with the past. It's not completely severed. It's not something that has disappeared. We still have the ability to remember these old stories. Crow had a story for the human girl child. Crow had work for her to do. And this, I suppose, is quite confusing for us. We need to understand what is that's driving this desire, and what is this crow spirit, or who is this crow spirit that's clearly going to have such an important job for someone like Sadie to complete, and how is she going to fulfill these expectations of this spirit that she's only just encountering for the first time. It really does set up some interesting relationships and interesting episodes later in the text. Well, I hope that's helped you with chapter 2 a little bit. I'll see you in a little while for chapter 3. This has been an ETV production brought to you by Printable Catholic College.